Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to stream two of this experiment to see if people want to have a chat about software engineering and see if we can get some people to participate maybe this time. I think no promises. We have a awesome guest coming later this in like 30 minutes or so, but we'll see. I see. Let's see here. So last stream we did some conversation about some various event sourcing topics, right? So uh, it's fun because I got some people who agree, some people who disagree, and I'd love to have more of that. So if anybody, maybe in chat or anybody, would like to come on stream and chat about that, that'd be great. Otherwise, we can sit here and talk to Twitch chat. That's cool too. Let's grab one person at a time. I'm not super prepared. I'm more prepared than I was last week, but it's like one of those baby steps things. All right, Chris, here I'm dropping you a message on X. If you would just go ahead and join, and you will come directly onto stream.
Hey,
Hey,
there we go.
welcome. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Yeah, you too. Hold on, let me just pause pause Twitch so that I don't get super echo here. There we go. All right.
Yeah, very cool. Last I talked to you, we were on a PHP Roundtable, I think.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That was fun.
Yeah, it was
I
fun.
had to cut out early, and I feel like I was listening to the end of it on my phone while I was getting ready to go to this concert, and I was like, I have things to say.
Well, what kind of things do you have to say? I would love to chat more, by the way, with you and Daniel. I think that's a very interesting conversation to be had there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that came up for me that I'm actually really interested in your thoughts on is um I think at least for right now, um the goal with verbs is to really sort of zero in on um event sourcing for the like traditional Laravel monolith, right? So like basically let's set aside sort of like distributed systems. Let's set aside like out of order delivery. Let's set aside like sort of like weird queuing considerations. not
Right.
not that that stuff isn't ever going to be a consideration, but like for a lot of Laravel apps, I think that you can still get a ton of benefit from thinking in events, right?
Absolutely.
And get some of the benefits of sort of like what people think about when they think about event sourcing, things like replays, all the kind of neat jazz. Although I think some of that stuff is overstated. Um, and so I'm curious. I think that the conversation at the roundtable started to get into um, more advanced messaging considerations and like conflict resolution, and I don't know, concerns that while obviously for big event source systems, those start to become things that you have to understand. I think for a lot of like small to medium sized web applications, you can get a lot of benefit from event sourcing without really having to jump into that. And that's kind of what I want to focus in on for a while with verbs. And so I guess my what I would love to talk about with you is just like, if you were setting aside some of the more of the like um, scale and distribution considerations, like are there any ways that you think you might simplify things to kind of make the experience easier for folks?
So I think that one of the reason that people talk about like all of these, like even verbs, right? So verbs, it talks about CQRS, right? Verbs is
Yep.
talking about projecting data and these other things, and that's not explicitly just sourcing models from events, right? So
Yep.
I think that all of the things you're saying, first of all, make sense to me, and I like that. Okay, and if anybody's watching and they're not familiar with verbs, verbs is a very like Laravelian kind of approach to event sourcing. It's a way to kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. It's I don't want to speak for your project, but it's a way to make a highly conventional approach to minimize the amount of work and the amount of uh, uh, maybe even like to lower the ceiling. Like, would you say to lower the ceiling, get people in thinking about events, being able to project state from events, this kind of thing, without necessarily having to deal with all the complexity that maybe like event sauce or something might bring?
Yeah, it's just trying to find a different balance. Minimize boilerplate and lower friction, and yeah, lean on convention. I think all those things are absolutely true. Um, and just maybe I think we're willing to sort of stay within a certain zone for right now, in exchange for kind of like make it easier to adopt and sort of focus in on simplicity. And I also think like focusing in on just like ergonomics. We want to get like the DX right first, even if we have to make certain trade-offs there, and then um, slowly try to find ways to like expand that while keeping that initial like sort of developer experience focus there, you know?
Yeah, like tweaking these knobs is always going to be a good thing. So the worst possible thing is if you have like one uh like way that like it's correct, and it's only
Right.
suitable for some people. And so like having a broad a range of approaches to select from to choose something that's right for you, I think is only good. You might hear like extreme people who are saying like, if you're not talking about aggregates and doing this thing in this specific way, then it's wrong.
Yep.
Because like, theoretically, like you could make these arguments. I just don't think they're good arguments. And I think that being an engineer of any kind is about like trade-offs, right? You don't There's a
Yep.
cost to everything, and you don't use the absolute best materials when you're over engineering a bridge. You don't over engineer a bridge, you just don't have the money for it, right?
Yep.
And so I'm all for this. My approach tends to be, I want to hit people with at least a taste of the theory and the taste of the complexity, so that they kind of
Hmm.
have to confront it. So I, like anything I do, I'm often talking about like aggregates and the cost of unbounded event streams and stuff like this, partially just because I feel like it gives a like a taste, or like a peek into the ether behind the veil of kind of what's going on here practically. Some people would say something like, "Oh, if," and I've seen this like recently. There's a very intelligent, like reasonable perspective that I heard over the past few days, where it's like, okay, if people are talking about event sourcing and they're talking about CQRS, or they're talking about aggregates or something like this, like run away, right? And I think that their view is that we should be talking about something like more scoped down, like tightly fit to the pattern. My view, though, is I want something that's very practical, and
Yeah.
I want to solve problems in the domain of like software engineering for business purpose. And so everything I say is baked around this. Like I don't need things to be done a specific way. I just want them to solve the problem ultimately. And so this is it's very easy for me to say something like Verbs is very cool, and Spassy's approach is cool, and Event Sauce is cool, and then my own homegrown approaches are also cool. Um, but at the same time, if I'm like giving advice to people, generally speaking, I want them to be warned about the cost of, for example, maintaining long running snapshots, maintaining snapshots, because that's like an entire subsystem that has to be managed, right? It's like an entire extra level of complexity. Oh, we need to make this change. Now we have to increase the amount of time budgeted for this change that could be avoided with modeling. But I think that I'm not trying to like ramble too far off your point, but I think
No,
that
go
if
ahead.
if you have to, if you present this some kind of solution and you like don't warn people, I do feel like there is an inevitable critical mass where you can, if you hit these practical problems, not you won't necessarily hit the practical problems, right? If you hit them, then it becomes like a real problem solving endeavor. Like you really have to kind of sit down and rethink, and then that means migrating streams or rethinking how these things work. Like, does this make sense? Like, this is my concern. This is my worry.
It does. I think my counterpoint to that would be, in my experience over my 25 plus years as a professional developer, um, I have I've had a many a time been told, well, you need to do something this way because you want to account for this like future eventuality. Um, you know, and a great example of that is maybe like relying on the repository pattern instead of just using your database directly, or using a ORM that's like more coupled to your database. In 25 years, I've never had to switch from one database to another, right? And so like all of the complexity that would have been added by adding this like additional layer of abstraction, by not introducing that, like, yes, if someday we need to switch between like two major database paradigms, like that's going to be some pain, but like, or that's going to be a lot of pain. But I think like from my experience, the reality is you just like, it's so hard to predict the future that trying to account for it now is often just like a waste of time. And so I think similarly, it feels to me like for a lot of web applications, um, most web applications are not going to deal with the type of scale that like people like to think about. It's fun to think about uh, uh, the massive scale, but a lot of web applications just never are going to get there. But they may be very successful, very useful, with plenty of users and making revenue. Um, and I think that those applications can benefit from event sourcing. They can benefit from these patterns. And I worry that if we warn folks too much about like the potential pitfalls, if they ever get to a certain point, to the point that they are scared off from like taking advantage of the pieces of this approach that could benefit them right now. I don't know what we're doing there. And I just think I've seen that happen enough with other patterns where it's like, people get scared off by, well, okay, if you're dealing with, 10 million requests per second, this is not going to work. So you can't use it right now. It's like, okay, well, if you're dealing with, if you're dealing with a million requests per second, like there's just like so many other scale problems that you're going to have to deal with.
I've heard that
Like you're,
argument before.
you know,
Yeah, I think
um,
the argument though, doesn't it just assume that you're not talking to these people now? Like, why are we talking to only the people who have 30 users? Like, I don't think that we are. I
I'm
think
not
that
saying
no,
30.
but
I'm saying
it's a
even
matter of scale
100,000
though. If
users,
if
right?
I am talking to people, there is in percent of those people are working on systems that have like a larger scale. And the larger scale, like these systems are, they hire more engineers to work on them. So it's, yes, there are fewer companies that have the scale, but there are more engineers working on at each of these companies. So why aren't we talking to them too? Can we get a little boost on my mic? I think I can. So uh, if I could, I'd like to speak to a few of these topics and then get your response. For one,
Yeah.
with the repository pattern, I switch databases with the repository pattern every time I run my tests. Um, so it's like I have like my production setup and then I have my test set up so that I can test something in isolation. The repository, having a repository set up, having an interface for that lets me swap that out at tests really easily. And so that's like
Oh,
kind
I'm
of
not saying it's not
immediately.
appropriate sometimes. I'm
Yeah,
just saying that it's
but
not always
if
necessary.
if you were to say uh want to change something about the system and it's expensive to do, the trade-off analysis is different. If you set up your system in a specific way such that things are easy to do, then I think it's more likely that we will do them. I, while I've heard this the repository argument many times. My personal view on this is at almost no cost, at virtually no cost, I get arguably, from my perspective, higher quality tests and uh, easier manipulation of the underlying storage mechanism, right? So and I would happily like discuss this at more detail, but I think it might be a bit of a side quest. I just feel like it's not that strange to be having discussions with people who are dealing with large amounts of traffic. I don't understand why we're segmenting or why we're so focused necessarily on only a small only systems of a specific scale, right? So if we say this solution is suitable only for systems at a specific scale, that's one thing. I don't think that we say that though.
No, no, I'm not saying that at all, but I do think that I don't know, maybe this is I think my experience is maybe just different in that I find that the vast majority of um, technology articles tend to focus more on the like the sexier high scale enterprise need.
Why?
And I think
Why do they
I
do
don't
that?
know. Because I think it's more exciting. I think it's more exciting to talk about the harder problems.
What do
I
you
think that
talk
it's more
about?
interesting.
You
Hmm?
probably talk about the problems that you're facing, right? So, like, is it like, I think it's like not unreasonable to consider that the people who are writing about these, I don't know that they're necessarily sexy, but these circumstances with different levels of scale, I think that maybe it's because people tend to generate content about the thing they're working on now. Like I'm realizing this thing, or I'm becoming passionate about this thing. I feel something about this topic, right?
Well, I think that's true, and I think that to some degree that comes from the fact that large companies that are dealing with this type of scale might have a whole um, developer evangelism uh, wing that is generating content. So I think that there is a good chance that like more of the content that you see online is coming from the Googles and the Microsofts and the folks that are able to pay people to create content that like sort of uh, is part of their strategy. But I think for me, my all I really am kind of coming to is Internet GR, my organization. We're uh, a relatively small organization, but we deal with um, you know hundreds of thousands of users, right? And millions of uh, visits. Like it's a successful mid-size business. It's not like a company with 30 users, right? It's not a company with 100 users. It's a decent sized application, and for our scale, which I think is like reasonable to encompass a lot of small to medium sized software businesses. Um, a lot of the considerations that require things like sharding and uh, out of order delivery queue systems and like sort of a lot of the pieces of the puzzle that make all of this a lot harder to do. Like we just don't need any of that. We can just write to MySQL. We can do most things synchronously. We can do some things asynchronously as needed. Um, and it's pretty much fine, right? And if we run into issues, we can literally just scale up the database or scale up our, Redis cluster or like whatever it is, add another web server, and that pretty much solves the problem, right? And so I think that there is there's like a large segment of the developer world that's working at you know, that size or smaller.
Hmm.
And I think that by focusing in on that like sort of segment, we can decide to make different trade-offs. And I think that some of those trade-offs can make these approaches um, a lot more inviting. And I think once you get your foot in the door, if you get into it, if you get interested in it, you can start to explore the more complicated or more sophisticated approaches to things. Um, but I think that when you start talking about all of the complexity that can be dealt with in event sourcing, it can be off-putting to people, and I think that like um, the biggest thing for me is the realization that events are what happen, right? And like getting your mind around this idea that like, oh, if I think about modeling what actually happens in my application rather than trying to model the result of each of those interactions, like it makes my life easier,
Yeah,
right? It makes
absolutely.
my time better. And
So
I think like I'd rather just focus in on like getting people a taste of that, uh, and letting them deal with any issues that they're going to come up with down the road when they get there.
yeah, let me ask you, your perspective on one more thing before I bring somebody else on.
Yeah.
How are you projecting your data? So like verbs, is it projecting get from through a queue, or is it projecting?
No, it's for the most part it's synchronous. Yeah, generally, so Verbs has sort of like a life cycle of there's like an authorization step, there's a validation step, then there's the apply phase, which is like the um, aggregation, right? Writing to the state, setting the state, which would be like the aggregate, right? Um, Once all of that happens, and we sort of know that the event is okay, as it were. Um, the event goes into like a in-memory queue, and then at the end, unless you commit that queue intentionally, then at the end of the request, all of your events are written to the database. And once you have confirmation that all the events have been written successfully, then we synchronously run all your projections. Um, and if you want to, you can fire off a queued job from the handle method in your event, or from the listener that's listening for this event, if you need to do something asynchronously. But for the most part, yeah, we just do it synchronously at the end of the request.
Yeah, okay. So this sounds to me like it's essentially the exact same way you would work with like Eloquent, like Active Record. You save it. Everything happens when you're saving it. There's like model observers, which like are you can use to project the data, something
Yeah,
like that, right?
it's in the same realm. It's not really utilizing those features, but yeah, it's in the same
Yeah.
realm of
So
thought.
if
Yeah.
you are doing all of this like synchronously, you're doing all this on save. If you're handling the transactionality of these commits, etc., for the user, then
Yep.
you can get away with a lot. There's no concurrency, no parallelization.
Yep.
Um, it does simplify the entire thing. As and I know that there's a migration path towards parallelization within
Hmm.
verbs, right? And
Yep.
so once you kind of jump to that, then you start to deal more with eventual consistency, with messaging problems, with queuing issues.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. I get that, and I think that that's great. I like the way that Verbs is making this more accessible and interesting to people. I don't have any complaints there, but I'm glad that you were able to bring up these topics that have been maybe rattling around since the PHP roundtable discussion.
Yeah, no, it's fun to get to talk about it, and I mean, I don't mean to say that like all of those are problems that you may very well get to, and I think that we'd love to have great solutions within like the Verbs ecosystem to be able to adopt. I know that a big thing that Daniel and I talk about right now is having some really great built-in systems to address sort of simple concurrency issues, right? Like because I think that there are some ways that we can mitigate some of the common issues around concurrency without having people, or without forcing people to change their mental model a whole lot. So I think there are opportunities there. And then I think, yeah, absolutely. Eventually, I'd love to have ways to bring in sort of like plugins or opt in to features that would like sort of unlock those, you know, something like okay, everything runs on the queue. We have to deal with eventual consistency, or like, you know, and conflict resolution and all those pieces. So I definitely think that that's down the road. But I think, yeah, you can just get a really long way without without doing that when you just do everything synchronously. You know what I mean? And you still get a lot of the benefits of modeling your application around events, right? And you get some of the cool features like replay and you know, I think it's like a nice balance that is like a great way to get started,
Yes, sounds
and
good.
gets you pretty far, you know?
Yeah, I think that's I would be interested to see how this unfolds for people who adopt the tool, like as they grow, like where this strains and how you're able to connect them with like the next stages in kind of like the pipeline or whatever, however you would see it. Thank
Yeah,
you so
it's
much
going to
for
be interesting.
chatting, Chris. I'm going to bring on the next caller.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
This has
much
been
for
fun.
joining. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'll talk to you later.
See ya.
Bye.
All right, very cool. Uh, nice to talk with Chris. I do agree that one of the like the most beautiful um, the most beautiful part about this is all just what it's like to interact with these events as things to interact in your system. Like you know when this thing happens, just to think about these things like this. Now I'm gonna bring on Frank de Jonge. Let's see.
Well, proper pronunciation.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Frank.
Hey, man, how's it going?
It's going good. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. It's been a while,
It has. It's been a while. You've been busy, haven't you?
man. Tell on many fronts, I've been very busy, business wise, in the uh, social life. Like I'm moving houses now, so I was just like when you pinged me for hey, do you want to have a chat? So it's like yeah, I was just tiling. So I'm right out of a tiling job in my new backyard. So yeah.
Very cool. That's awesome for you. I wanted to talk to you about some of the like the more falling through the cracks parts of event sourcing and like I'm very practical with this. So like we all know like the when you're event sourcing, there's like this very core part that's the event sourcing part, and then there's like all of the surrounding junk that comes when you want to deal with various aspects, right? So I'm personally I'm interested in all of it. Um, but I'm curious to you, like, are there things uh, that you feel get swept under the rug more than others and maybe not talked about because it's like either difficult to talk about them or maybe sometimes people don't have the experience?
Hmm. So the immediate one is probably all of the things around replaying of event streams. Like it's always sort of grazed over. This is one of the things that definitely benefits from a serious amount of tooling, and also benefits from experience of having done that a couple of times before. Because like just to name one aspect, right? So people say, we just replay it. But like if you have a serious amount of events or you have
Right.
a very serious amount of aggregates, then you know this is not something that you'll just do in a jiffy and you'll be over and done with this sort of stuff. So even those kind of things require some additional tooling, and even from a mindset of I want to retain the ability to deploy as frequently as I want, and then to think about long running processes that sort of replace state within the entire application, and then need to rebuild that. that in itself is sort of like a bucket of complexity that you just whip open. And when talked about, it's always like very superficial. Oh, it's great. You can replay and you can recreate everything. Yeah, sure, but it's like how? All right. Somebody's asking if I want coffee or tea. A coffee? Yeah. This is one of the perks of moving to the nether regions of the Netherlands.
Coffee tea?
Coffee tea? Yeah. So I get some nice coffee now. But yeah, that's definitely one of the things. We discussed the particularities about snapshotting and maybe not being the best thing in the world to do, but sometimes every time you paint yourself into a corner, and nobody always makes the right decisions from the start. So sometimes you have to redraw boundaries, and sometimes these boundaries, until you've redrawn them, they hurt a little bit. So I do think that snapshotting is sort of a escape hatch, not a desired thing. Nobody wants to fundamentally rely on the escape hatch as their sort of first resort. But then it's definitely a good safe haven if you need it, or if the consequence of not being able to redraw the boundaries right away is too severe.
Right.
So in that sense, yeah, it's always.
I mean, it kind of brings the problem of caching that caching, the problems caching has always had, right?
Yeah. So for me, it's like the whole replaying. So snapshotting in itself, like if you look at it from I'm starting out a new aggregates or whatever, something that is event sourced, and I want to use snapshotting, and I do it from the start. You have sort of this rolling snapshot, and everything is sort of fine and dandy. But then after a while, because you are able to reinterpret the things that happened in the past, you also want to exploit this fact. So that means that whatever did happen in the past, that you need a new interpretation of that. And that means that whatever you've interpreted up until this point is no longer so like fitting the model that you currently want to have in place. And because a snapshot is effectively, well, the name snapshot kind of says it. It's a snapshot of like what the thing can do, or what the thing knows in order to make the next decision. It should know something different now. So that's that needs to be facilitated. But for me, that kind of falls into the same bucket as projections being replayed. So you have some kind of model, you create it, you maintain it, and then something changes in your understanding of the problem, and now it needs to change. Can't be done right away. So you have to, well, again, rely on some tooling in order to make that a reality. Yeah.
Can I put you on the spot a little bit and ask you?
Yeah, sure.
You brought up projections and some of the complications there. I know how I solve this, but I'm interested in, so if you want to make a change and need reproject, but you also have, during your deployments, during all these things, multiple replicas of your application running at the same time. There's a lot of complexities happening, multiple versions running at the same time. You want zero downtime, right, during these processes. How do you go about the process of projecting new state, maybe out of band, so that it's not like currently being used, and then dealing with the switchover, this kind of thing? How do you like from a very practical perspective?
From a very practical perspective, well, so it's never a change really in the. So if it's a non-breaking change, like so you can just roll forward and you just go for it. There's no sense in adding too much ceremony around things. So not every change warrants a replacement, but for more severe, I think it's definitely a replacement. So you put the new thing next to the old thing, and you let it catch up effectively. Very practically speaking, because the way that I do it now, and I'm working on a fully event sourced application written in TypeScript, and we've got some situations that steer the choice of particular tooling within the system, and that those things steered again some operational choices that we made, especially in the realm of replaying. So the TLDR is that we use Postgres to store events, and we use an outbox combined with a relay towards RabbitMQ in order to consume that. So a particular a frequently used tool for event-sourced applications is Kafka, also because of the ordering. But in our case, we had to do with intermittent unavailability of somewhere that we needed to push information to. So you need out of order processing for those cases in order to not have a poison pill that sort of has a line blocking mechanism. So when we then looked at these technologies and know that we have out of order processing that we need to deal with anyway, we also needed a solution for that. And for that, we actually use the versions of the aggregates in order to detect whether there have been messages previously not consumed that you expect to be consumed. So whenever one of our consumers gets a message, it's for a particular aggregate and it's of a particular version. So say we have a normal consumer has been up to date all of this time, gets a new message, doesn't know the aggregate is version 4. The current offsets is implicitly 0 because we didn't know about this aggregate before. So we know that we're sort of up to date. Now, a new message might come in of a existing aggregate, but then on version 2, well, we can look up the offsets for the current aggregate. We don't know it yet, so it's version 0, but we get back version 2. So in the delivery mechanism towards the inner consumer, so this is sort of the tooling around it, that offset management is happening within the same sort of database transaction that the projection happens in. And when we detect that, we simply infix those messages, replay, get them from the event store, which is Postgres in this instance, and then get back basically on par with what we've had before. And so we can use this mechanism to a large extent if we have reasonably sized aggregates in order to do just a trigger over all of the aggregates that we know, that we have sort of like a synthetic event that we push through the pipeline, so that we paginate over all of the aggregate root IDs that we know, and then basically push out that synthetic event. And all of the projections, because they infill, they basically put themselves in the correct state again. Now, and so this can happen in parallel to the normal event stream, just flushing their events through. So either the consumer that uses the synthetic event gets to do the job of rebuilding the aggregate, but if something happens to the aggregate, that a normal message will have the same sort of like self-healing properties in a sense, in order to get back to the current most accurately known state. So in that sense, the normal world and the world of rebuilding stuff is tactically quite similar due to some of these choices that we made.
Sure, that makes sense. So we have a couple questions here on the stream. I'm just gonna see maybe what you have to say about them. If you were to be taking a system and you believe that you want to benefit from evolving it into a model from a traditional ORM model to like an event source model, how might you go about that?
So the first thing I do is that all of the so first, we need to look at what kind of ORM are we dealing with. So the thing that you want to make sure that you do first is that you capture intent. You could say more like a active record style. You just mutate the properties of a data model effectively, right? There's almost no intent there. So you want to make sure that you start tapping into understanding the intent of the mutation first. So that means that
okay, sorry, go ahead. Like that means like that basically instead of manipulating the fields within it from external sources, you're actually expressing I'm implementing this business process, or I'm doing something
yes,
like I'm publishing something. I'm not setting the published at timestamp.
yes. So tactically, like super concrete, instead of saying, well, this published at now gets a new timestamp, you say, well, published at, you say publish, and then internally, like you pass it in a clock, so you can figure out what time it is, and then now you've internalized the consequences of responding to that command or request or whatever you like to call it. So this allows you not only to then be in control of the state changes, you understand the intent, but you can side by side now starting to record events that that are relevant for the intent. So so you
Kind of
retain.
summarize, like we had this like maybe a structural model, a data model that we're manipulating, and
Yeah.
then we want to migrate the way that we interface with that model such that instead of directly manipulating the state of that model, we are expressing intents. Like instead of saying I am setting the published at timestamp and then I'll know that the state it was published, I can call the publish method and that will encapsulate the state changes. And then within that, I can, for example, make the state changes necessary. In the publish method, I can set publish at, but I can also like create an event, an actual like a representation of that that's more domain oriented, that's more process oriented within that model.
Yeah. And so usually when you're talking about going from a model that's, well, it's existing, like there are other things already interested, and often what you see in these kind of systems is that other consumers are not really fed into the information stream of what's happening, events that are recorded, but they're actually directly accessing and querying the database that was used for the internal storage. So in order for you to make sure that you can actually radically change the internal model, you need to make sure that you provide an alternate means of integration with that model, because the model does not operate in
Okay,
isolation.
but what does this mean? Like, what is this alternate? Uh, traditionally,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So traditionally, we have a bunch of database tables, and they're represented in the application with objects, and these objects interrelate. So you can like think about the relationships they might have, like has many belongs to, and largely we just traverse this graph of data in order to manipulate the related data. So if we were to have a concrete example, maybe we could say, maybe you have a concrete example already queued up.
Nothing particular. Well, we can look at payments as one thing, right? So payments where you have the sort of intent to pay and then trying to fulfill that intent using a transaction or whatever. And so everything that needs to know about payments can just query the payments tables,
Yes.
right? So, well, you're talking about a situation where people are sort of neatly using the ORM models. Well, it's never quite that neatly. People also just do raw queries and access parts of the table, might join or otherwise manipulate those the results that they get from the query to for their own benefit, right? People take the sort of shortest, easiest route. And if the concrete model is not providing that route, well, they will just dig a shortcut, like dig a hole through the fence and get what they need
Yeah,
anyway.
I've seen,
Yeah.
so in my work, we have implemented a transaction processing system with an event source model largely, right? And so I've seen the whether it's from lack of experience, which is completely fine, or any other
Mm.
reason, I've seen that like a frustration in how much harder it is to kind of hack your way through accessing data, right? So, for example, like let's say you have an event stream, and you want to be able to reflect on information in that event stream. Well, what can you do? You can just read the event stream and directly pull the information out of the event stream, right?
Yeah.
So, is this something that you have a problem with that you would do?
Advocate? No, I would advocate for it. So um, with one caveat is that you need to be cognizant of the visibility of information. So much like if you have a data model where you keep things, some things are public, some things are private. And when you're talking about event streams, you basically have the same dynamic. Everything that you externalize and that other people couple to or depend upon limits your ability to be in control over changing that model, because now you introduce breaking changes. If the downstream consumers of that are important within the company, that could provide serious friction. So sometimes it's resourcing within the company that totally blows a change out of the water simply because they cannot adapt to the new reality. So one of the things that I like to have at least tooling and understanding for within a company that I work for is the notion of anti-corruption layers, which are basically sort of translation gateways, either for incoming stuff or for outgoing stuff. And for outgoing stuff, you basically enforce the visibility of things, so you can limit what you actually externalize, and then in additionally, you put yourself in a position where you can translate information. So even if your understanding has evolved, but the understanding of your downstream consumers are still somewhat more rudimentary, if changing something requires them to be deploying their logical changes in lockstep, again, this within an organization can be very difficult.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
So like basically the deployment and change of these systems is always multi-faced, right? You always have to kind of set it up first, get it out. So now you have like kind of two concurrent things running at the same time, and then you go through and
yeah,
clean it up afterwards. It's like a recurring theme, basically.
yeah,
Um, so we briefly discussed kind of the first steps of transitioning like from like a traditional ORM model, right? Like get direct access and manipulation of the state gone, put it behind intentful changes, uh, like kind of have like intentful changes and through events and the relational changes at the same time, and then eventually as you decouple from the more traditional like ORM way of developing,
yeah.
uh, you can kind of migrate over. But then you have to deal with things like, okay, um, your how do you access that state if not through eventually consistent uh, a source, right? So let me ask you a question. Like, what is your tolerance for immediately consistent projections or CQRS, like immediately consistent CQRS?
My personal tolerance for that is quite high. Within the tooling that we've created for the company that I work for, we have sort of like our own internal little event sourcing framework that sort of closely matches event source, which I created. And one of the things is that's built in is that you can register yourself as a synchronous or an asynchronous consumer. And then all of the sort of wiring internally will, if you're a synchronous one, it will put you in the same database transaction as the storing of events and the publishing of the outbox. Now, I do think for the projections, largely it's okay. Anything with external side effect or the external world can fail, the tolerance is blown right out of the window, right? So that's sort of close to a non-negotiable situation. There are some ways where you can do optimistic tries, but then your retry mechanism. So if it works, fine. Otherwise, don't bother. And then in the normal background consumption, you check whether it was done, which is sort of an enter pattern in itself. But if the latency of coupling to that external is a very tight fit, then you might go that route. But otherwise, like the default is only projections that are stored within the same data store that are transactionally guaranteed to fail or pass, and only do that after you've initially introduced the model. So the model is introduced first in an async way in order to catch up, right? It's a new model based on existing information, so you can't really block that in that sense. And then some things might be promoted to synchronous. And there are a couple of cases where this actually sometimes makes sense. So, for example, if you have consistency guarantees over multiple aggregates, people usually say, and I think it's a generally good doctrine, that you have consistency within an aggregate, but across aggregates it's sort of like asynchronous. But then you also get into conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is inherently difficult, so you want to not always sort of expose yourself to having to mitigate the downsides of that. So let's make a concrete example. Maybe not the best one, but it will illustrate. Let's say that you have, well, actually, I think it's a fair example. Let's say that you have a multi-step onboarding with a company for an account registration. So you set up your account, you need to do multiple steps in order to have sort of like a full account. Well, you can use event sourcing or to do that. At the end of the sort of like aggregate lifecycle, you can promote that to your user account that's available in the system. Now, for user accounts, usually people have a username or an email, and that is usually guaranteed to be unique in the system. Right? You can't have two people with the same email address within the same system or username. So now, how do you go about guaranteeing that uniqueness, which is effectively a consistency guarantee that you want to guard for, want to enforce within the system, but you're working over multiple entities. So now you have this cross-entity synchronicity or consistency thing that you want to get. Well, for this, an in-sync projection is actually, I think, probably the most pragmatic solution that I could think of. Otherwise, you go into on the back reconciliation, or like a conflict resolution of which of these account flows actually created the first thing. Yeah, that's super difficult, and arguably like the chances of this hitting are slim to none. But you do want to enforce it. So the in-sync projection here is just a very pragmatic way to solve that.
Now, I have a question. Why do you keep writing your own event sourcing libraries?
Because I'm somewhat of a, what's it, a masochist, or no. So in this particular instance, in the TypeScript ecosystem, I really didn't find anything that matched many of the sort of engineering values that I hold. Some of the open source tooling I've seen does event sourcing, but then is sort of very data centric in the events, and I like it more less like heavy on the data. Like some frameworks, they say, well, this is the property bag and you can just add anything, and then I lose a lot of type inference out of that. I don't know what is part of the event, what is not. There are some things that I've accumulated over the years that I always want in an event sourcing system. Particularly having the ability to have a payload, and then in addition to that, have a more generalized headers
Like a
segment
message
for more of
envelope.
so message envelope, all of those kind of concepts. So and I also think that it's a great way to teach people how to event source. So if they can be exposed to the guts of the system, and they're also able to contribute to it, and um, by contributing, they have to build a certain amount of knowledge in order to make that meaningful change. And now my job onboarding people has gotten a lot easier, because like being exposed to the code and being able to manipulate it forces them to first sort of understand it, and then be comfortable enough in order to make the change. And this is usually where a lot of the conversations around event sourcing starts. So sometimes people wander in a direction that would fit more with a CRUD mindset. And then this sort of a natural point where we just have a conversation about, like, all right, maybe we don't go this route, we go this route instead. Or it's like people are looking for the not idiomatic approach for something, and then it invites for a good conversation. So
Yeah,
it's
in my experience, there's a lot of coupling to the technology choices you're making or the architectural choices you're making, and you have written event sauce, which is a little bit more general than like you
yeah
would make your own, like if you were just making the application for yourself, right? So I think event sauce, I've talked to a lot of people, and somebody mentioned this in chat earlier, that event sauce has a lot of knowledge requirements. You don't just wander into it and start making an application, right?
no
So kind of one of the reasons I have avoided picking up something like Axon Framework or something is I
yeah
don't want a generalized monolithic thing that services all these different potential circumstances, because to me it just drives the complexity up so high, and I want to
hmm
focus on like what are the properties of the system that are important in my environment. I want my colleagues to be a part of the decision making for how we move forward with those approaches, rather than it all being entirely prescriptive. And I think one of the interesting things about event sauce and why I recommend it for people who aren't going. First of all, I recommend them building their own their own software, because that to me is just the way you will actually learn this stuff. But event sauce is to me like an easy default for PHP. I've used
yeah
it professionally. I've used it privately, but uh, how much do you think like it really takes to get homegrown event sourcing library functional in a production environment?
Oof. Well, so that really depends on a good couple of things, like a production environment. The requirements for that can be very varying between companies. That said, I think a minimal setup can be done in a couple of uh, production ready, a couple of days. It's not rocket surgery, not by any stretch of the imagination. It is a select events from table where identifier matches something, play them all back in order to get to a state where you can make a new decision, and then on storing, uh, only store the ones that are new that you haven't reconstituted from. All of this, I think, you could fit pragmatically in under 150 lines of code. Um, Talking to a database, inserting and selecting from it. and having some sort of repository interface where you can get the entity in and get the entity out. So it is relatively technically straightforward. I think the more difficult part is knowing how to keep it this simple, right? So it took me definitely multiple iterations in order to get there, and I sort of expect that for anybody to to do this. For like when I recreated sort of like event source, but then event source homegrown in TypeScript, it was also the largest amount of time was actually spent on trying to find things that were idiomatic in TypeScript and in the JavaScript thing, not necessarily the core of the
Yeah,
problem of
that's
event
what I'm
sourcing.
talking about. Like, so you have your language, you have your this whatever infrastructure that you have available to you, like tying, making a good solution in the context of this environment, like the language and all these other things. To me, that's like what I want to be doing when
Yeah,
I'm writing software, because I want the simplest possible thing that I need to get the properties from the software that I want, right? And
yeah,
so like I'm doing a lot of Elixir like in my spare time, not at work. At work I'm
yeah.
like 100% Java, which is not my favorite, to be completely honest. But with like Elixir, being functional, being everything is just simpler. It's like
Mm,
when you look at the aggregate, like the consistency boundary that I would build,
yeah,
the whole thing is just it's almost like it's made for like a functional paradigm. If I'm completely honest, like to
yeah.
me, event sourcing is very functional. So do you think that if you're going to be building a system like this, there is a reason that you might go for like one language or something over another, or do you think that those decisions need to be made more for other reasons?
So in this particular case, we chose TypeScript because we have a very front end heavy business also that we are in. So there's a lot of logic in the back end, and there's a lot of logic shared with the front end. Uh, in addition to that, the team wanted to remain relatively nimble. And so if you then split out, or if you either force people to learn two languages, the talent pool that you have access to is somewhat more slim, and also you're maintaining two stacks. So that's why we wanted to have sort of one language, and then the choices there are relatively limited, right? So you could do Kotlin and then compile to JavaScript, of course, but that's more of like it's not a super popular choice in that realm. So we stuck with the norm. Um, for specifically the event sourcing stuff, I think in most languages like are perfectly fine. The one that I found a little bit difficult to create event sourcing tooling for was Go, actually, because there it was a little bit more difficult to do very uh, dynamic stuff where like JavaScript, PHP, Java all have somewhat more of a particular way to do some dynamic stuff. Either with annotations or otherwise, in order to put some convenience into the hands of people. With Go, that was a lot more difficult, but it's difficult to go into specifics there because it's been quite a while since I've done that with Go. But it didn't very much work. I don't have personally any experience with Elixir, but very curious sometime to see a stream where you actually uh, do flesh out sort of the base event sourcing tooling.
Yeah, I have been just in my spare time rebuilding like the model that I have at work
Mm,
in Elixir, because what I want to do is I just want to like just have this machine running, 1,000 transactions a second or something, just synthetically generating all this stuff. and just watch the system and look for constraints, like where I find a constraint, clean it up, level the line out again, the performance line, and then keep going, right? So I'm looking for the same level of durability, the same like exactly once kind of guarantees. Um, how do I deal with split brain, right? Like these kind of things, because of course Elixir is built on Erlang, which has like a cluster model for scaling. So I
Hmm.
would like to do it idiomatically within that actor model context, within that cluster context. But still, like I would like to remove some of the complexity of like consensus algorithms, or like the Raft protocol or something like this to deal with
Hmm.
that. And so I'm just trying to like navigate that path. And so yeah, I would like to talk more about that as I kind of figure that out. Um, Thankfully, like having the chance to work in this environment where I have high consistency requirements, where I have high durability requirements, is really forcing me to really think through and like kind of get over some of the shortcuts I've been taking, because the shortcuts are fine, right? Like the shortcuts work great. I built an app like a long time ago that didn't even have any kind of queuing. It just immediately executed all of the event reactions, and largely for my business, for that purpose it was fine. But now I'm not
Yeah.
in a situation where that's this true anymore.
Yeah. It's like one thing that you mentioned, like you're in an environment where all of these things are needed. Like I would say, like if repetition is the mother of learning, then necessity sure as hell is its dad, right? So there's no better school than necessity. In that sense, yeah, yeah. Having been in similar situations, I can only say that it's a privilege to be in a situation where you have to solve these kind of things, where it's just not. It's like you can have high consistency guarantees for recording all of the likes of a social media company, but that would just be ridiculous because like there's nothing going wrong if some of the likes just never
Yeah.
get stored, right? So it's like no revenue is lost, no nothing. I would say revenue is lost if you make sure that you are making this consistent. So yeah, being in that situation where you have to is absolutely fully enjoyable. Yeah.
The model in an event source system is like it's different, it's spread differently in the project than a kind of, when you think of a structural model, like if you use like a framework with an ORM, you have a data model. You largely think of the data model as like the model. And
Hmm.
when I'm working on an event source system, I'm thinking like there's this whole huge chunk of the application that I just now call a model. And when I say that the events are the underlying state of that model, generally, like of course the reality is I wouldn't event source everything in the system. You pick and choose the parts that benefit from it, right? And where the penalties are lower and the advantages are higher. But when I think about like events as the state of the model, I'm thinking about like all of the parts of the events touch. And there's like this weird like getting familiar with the idea type, I think, rite of passage, where you start to realize that what an entity is not necessarily represented by like a class or some kind of construct. Like an entity is like anything that's implied or referred to by an identifier. And
Hmm.
this can be spread not only over multiple constructs in the system, but also from different perspectives, right? And so this, to me, this being able to see things from different perspectives is a really beautiful part of like having a model that's event source. So I have this example where I I look at the same event from two perspectives, and I cross the event streams at this point.
Hmm.
And so each, like one side says, hey, let me think of like an analog. Let's say I want to have an order, but I don't want the order to start two payments, right?
Hmm.
I'm making an order an e-commerce thing. So I might have this concept that represents an order for the purpose of knowing when a payment's beginning.
Hmm.
And I cross the event stream of the payment processing part, with the order part. So whenever I go and I start to make a payment, the order stream is immediately consistent with a lock, right? Saying that this payment is starting. So if I try to start another one, there's already an event in the
Yeah.
stream, and it's able to block that, right? So I do a lot of like this double bookkeeping when I'm thinking about it. Do you have much experience with that? Is that something that you find to be a common pattern for you?
Yeah. So one of the common things I see when like this is event design and communication between subsystems and then taking into account some of the additional requirements, like you mentioned, the consistency requirement in effectively a downstream system from the order system, which is the payment system. Right. So now you have to make sure that you empower the payment system in order to facilitate their requirements in that sense. So you need to supply it with consistent information so that they can consistently enforce their consistency. Man, that's a lot of consistencies after each other. But it's like effectively, yeah, that's one of the cases. Sometimes it's one of the cases that I think I deal like this is what you're describing. You don't deal with that super often. Like there's a couple of times when you have to do it, and it's very important that you do it right, because if you don't, you really suffer the consequences. There are other cases that are far, in my experience at least, far more like they occur much more often. They're not as uh, they're not as important, but they can still affect you. And that is, so for example, say that a downstream system needs to do a particular action at the sort of the third event that occurs.
So when
So
you're saying
you
downstream, like a completely different boundary, like a different context, like
uh,
different team owns it, they're just receiving messages from you over a contract.
yeah. Yeah. So let's make sort of a stupid dummy case. We want to send somebody an email when their registration was completed, and the registration is a multi-step process. Within this email, we will need their name, we will need their email, we need something that we also recorded within the whole registration process in order to, like, maybe it's a reason for onboarding, or they had a question and you want to say, hey, this was your question, we're going to get back to you, or whatever. Now, if you look at sort of the events of that registration flow, it might be, all right, somebody filled in their primary contact information, so that's email and phone, and then next up they fill out the personal profile, so it's their first name and the last name, and then in the last step they fill out the reason. So when they fill out the reason, that's might be sort of the conclusion of this process. So now there are sort of two categories of problems that emerge out of this situation. So one is that, well, if you're a downstream consumer and you have to sort of like assemble and collect over multiple events all of the things that you need for one interaction, right? So your integration requires you to do, I consume the first event, I can't do anything yet, but I need to remember this. All right, the second event comes, I need to do the same. The third event comes, now I've collected all of the things, I can put it into a bag, and now I can execute my operation. Well, so this is a piece of burden that is caused by the event design of the publishing domain of that the consuming boundary needs to accommodate, right? So their job is more difficult because of the design of the event. So a possible solution for this is actually to replicate information within events in order to, so that the last event sort of like echoes all of the things that it had before. It reconstitutes that information anyway, so it knows about that information anyway. But so you don't really go for dry, but more you you flesh out a little bit more so that one of the downstream consumers has a full concepts rather than three partials. So that's one part of the problem and
That's
a
just creating
possible solution.
like a layer where you're mapping like this the incoming, like the acknowledgement of the model of the upstream to the acknowledgement of what the downstream needs, and you're
Yeah,
doing the work to optimize for the downstream for them.
yeah, yeah. So there's always this thing where in communication, communication is always sender receiver. Somebody adapts, and so there. If you're not adapting, you're probably in the same system.
Why aren't
So
we talking about
that's
context mapping more? Why do we have like DDD come out 20 years ago and only people only talk about repositories, but like people don't talk about context mapping, right?
Sorry, my wife was just signaling. I'm not sure if I fully understood what was signaled, but um, anyway, yeah, it's crazy. Like why haven't we? Yeah, because like it's so fundamental to just like communication in general, and all of the things that apply to modeling communication apply to modeling systems to a large degree, but we sort of graze over it. But getting back to that same example, there's a second thing that I think is even less visible, but perhaps more important. It is the fact that the second thing knows, like, oh, there are three events, they come in a particular order, and this one is the last one. And then now I'm aware that the process in this other thing is completed. So first comes the email, then comes the name, and then comes the reason. Now I'm good to go. Right. So implicitly, well, one, you have a sort of like an ordering um, uh, uh, um, understanding of that. So now this downstream thing knows about the ordering of the events, but also know that there's nothing additionally going to happen. But you might also be in a place where additional steps happen in the registration process. Maybe a um, um, there's a page where people need to say whether they like lasagna or not, like something else, and they're able to go back. So they're able to correct what information they had before, and when they correct it, a new event comes in. So now, if that new step comes in and this downstream system is not aware that this has changed, they will their previously known last event is not the last event that they should be integrating with in the new reality, but nothing at a for information stream level actually tells them if they had a flawed understanding. So part of this is focusing on, like the solution to this is focusing on, again, these ACLs, right? Making sure that you have a translation boundary. You can do the translation there, accumulate the state, and then actually facilitate so that the downstream party just gets a full construct of all of the things that are relevant to them. But an additional thing that you can actually do is explicitly mark the end of things. So, for example, you do the first the credentials, then the name, then the reason, and then in the end, when it is completed, even if it's just happening in that same action, you additionally record an event that says, well, the registration was now completed, and this is the information that was completed from the registration. So it's not implicitly knowing because I understand the process. It's told to you explicitly, this is the end. So you don't need to do interpretation of anything that's in between.
It's interesting because I feel like a lot of these solutions, when people talk about solutions to these event streams or communication problems, it's like everything sounds too easy. It's just
Yeah.
you just wait until this happens, or you say this thing, and one of the things I like about these architectures is that I feel like it like more than ever before in my career, the problems I'm dealing with are uh, just like more fundamental. Like it's not just you hear, oh, we need to do this, and you try to start doing that gigabrain thing where you map uh, all of the job requirements to the relational database and then map it out.
Mm.
Like everything becomes much more like isomorphic, even like it's shaped the same.
Yeah.
Um, Now I know we only have a few minutes left, but can you tell me, do you have any like pet peeves or like things that you are like really kind of push people away from, something that you recommend to just avoid you see people doing?
Well, I've got an interesting take on that because it was a recent pet peeve of mine, and I've recently unpet peeved it. So
Okay.
maybe that's an interesting one. So one of the things that I generally don't like is to use aggregates or consistency boundaries for read models. So you can use it as sort of like a in place, like a live projection, if you
Yeah,
will.
so you put like a getter methods on the
You put a
aggregate.
getter on it, yeah. So that thing that's like it reeks, it stinks. You don't want to have it. But so when we started this new company with two people that came from a different company that I came from, and they had mostly worked with CRUD-based models, and so we were starting out in rapid succession. I started out with the first engineers together. Like I started a little bit before, but the other engineers signed first. And we started out, and I was making some architectural decisions. One of which is to use event sourcing for many of these things. So that forced the other two that joined actually to start learning a whole lot. And uh, one of the things that they were used to is also having their, it's like people call it right model. I hate that term. That's another pet peeve. I like decision model a lot more, or consistency boundary if you look at it from a different perspective. So it makes decisions and it needs to be consistent, or two viewpoints on the same model that is otherwise sometimes referred to as an aggregate. But in order for them to maneuver in this system that I was making some decisions for, they need a particular level of comfort. Otherwise, they don't move. They don't have a good time. And I think having a good time in the code base is something that can really be
I definitely
motivating for
struggle
people.
with this, working with the team, like the balance between like what we're doing architecturally and then also giving people more freedom and more comfort in their code
Yeah,
base.
yeah, yeah. So by allowing effectively getters on the aggregates, they could maintain for a while the old mental model that they have of, I have an entity, I load the entity, I do something. Well, okay, internally it uses events, okay, but then I save it. And in order for me to read off the entity, I just load it and I call a method in order to get the information that I want. So this mental model is something that they could retain for that time. That gave them the comfort in order to be confident about how to approach certain types of problems. And I had to, like, when that was sort of happening, it went kind of organic. It was a relatively small moment. I was like, all right, I'm already sort of like explaining a lot about like how this new event sourced system sort of works fundamentally. What will go wrong if we allow this, right? If we just don't go for the quote unquote right path on this. Well, the one thing that would happen is that we need to uh, change the model for these getter situations into a projection at a later point in time. Then I was like, all right, what does this fundamentally look like? Well, all of the things that we had up until that point were just a model that receives an event that has an event routing set of tools and then manipulates internal state in order to have this outcome. Well, okay, what's the difference between that within an aggregate root and within a projection? Yeah, it's literally nothing. So the worst that will have to happen is that we'll need to get only the event application logic, change the topology of that, sometimes even duplicate it. And it's like, what's the expense in that? Well, there's actually not a huge amount of cost related to that. So, but having people that are not comfortable and not confident enough in order to make significant changes within a code base, that cost is significant, right? So in order to keep the amount of things that they had to learn and adopt and adapt to relatively low, we incurred this expense, and we just went with it. And I can say to this point, and we're about a year and a half in, we're sailing quite happily. So yeah, that was a big pet
But
peeve.
were you
But
able to like migrate off of that, or do you have an interest in migrating off of that? Like I don't understand. Like
we
what's the future
consistently
looking?
do. Yeah. So for cases where things get more involved, like we have sort of a complexity threshold, and that's sort of that's not really a concrete rule set or anything. It's just like, all right, when people think, this is actually becoming a little bit more involved, then we start the discussion like, hey, is this the time? It's always the question as when is the time? It's never if it's the time, right? So there's an implicit understanding that this what we're doing is a temporary measure. We do it as long as as we benefit from it. As soon as we don't, we know what step to take, and we've got tooling outlined to select. All right, we're not going to use the aggregate route anymore. What does the upgrade path look like? We have relatively simple tooling for making projections. So one of the things that really helped is a standard key value store abstraction, which covers like 80% of the use cases of any projection that we have. So that's facilitated. We have standard tools to put stuff behind queues. It's very easy to subscribe to information. And we have standardized tools to rebuild models from the ground up. And that's sort of trifecta lowers the barrier of entry of moving it out. So you make the thing that you want to see happen as cheap and as comfortable as possible from the people that you want to see it from. And that's really sort of like the magic sauce in this equation. If you leave out any of the three, I don't think you're going to have a good time.
Right, that makes sense to me. So thanks a lot for having this conversation with me. Would you like to? Do you have any parting words for us?
I do not, but I really enjoyed this conversation, Sean, and well, hope to speak with you soon again.
Nice. See you, Frank.
See ya.
Okay, very cool. I'm going to bring on Bastian. I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but let's get someone from chat in here. So Frank is one of the people that I know with the most experience with event sourcing and building systems at scale.
Hey there. Hey,
Hey,
Sean.
welcome.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I hope you can hear me. I'm
Yeah,
calling in
clear.
from Cologne, Germany, so not too far away. I think you're in Amsterdam, if I'm right.
Just south in Utrecht.
All right. Yeah, it was really interesting to hear a conversation, and I think I have a topic that fits in quite well. And that is an idea I would like to pitch with you, or if you already know it, have it challenged. It was already mentioned in the chat, a dynamic consistency boundary. I don't know if you've heard of it.
So I have heard of it. So the idea, and correct me if I have the wrong perspective, right? The idea is rather than storing events in streams necessarily, you tag events such that they belong in kind of like a multiple potential boundaries. Like how does that work exactly? So you can query against a tag, and then you have almost like multiple aggregates that can operate on multiple streams.
That's right. So maybe if I do a little detour of what it's trying to solve, and that is, well, you also talked about consistency, and that's one of the things I observed people struggle with a lot, myself included. So you get into event source and you learn how to deal with eventual consistency and so on, but then you still have these constraints, be it hard constraints or soft constraints. So what I would say, like a soft constraint is when the read model is enough to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
But like for the username example, that classical one, is it's a bit difficult because you really don't want to have two usernames twice. I mean, in large scale you might need to, and then you come in this conflict resolution stuff. But it just adds a lot of complexity. So the means to enforce these immediate consistencies with event sourcing is the by spreading it into events and then use that optimistic locking mechanism we all know. But at least for me, it was not. It was more like an by the way thing. It's almost like an implementation detail. It's not like it. It's like you have event sourcing, and then you also the implementation to make it consistent. That's why I have to spread it into streams, and the difficulties that come with it, we all know, is that it's quite rigid. That you, well, people make the mistake that you in your last stream mentioned with like mixing it a little bit with the aggregate term of the DDD. So they build the aggregates around entities basically. But even if you don't, you just need it to enforce consistency. And so the idea of dynamic consistency boundary is, and by the way, that's not my idea. It's an idea by Sarah Pellegrini brought it up. She's
Kill the aggregate.
Right. She has a blog post about it and some talks. Yeah, she's working on the action framework as far as I know. And well, we discussed together and discussed some details, but the original idea is from her. And the idea is, yeah, like you said, so think of the current persisted event model where one event belongs to a stream, and in that stream it has a version, but on top of that it has the global sequence number, so there can't ever be two events with the same global sequence number. And then drop both concepts of stream name and the version, and instead, like you said, we just add the notion of tags. And a tag is just, it's opaque to the event store, but it's something that is relevant to your domain. So it's a domain concept. So in the username example, it could be the username or a hash of the username that is used. And so on top of that, you add the possibility in the event store to query, to filter the stream. Now, well, in the classical event store, you can filter by stream or read from all streams usually.
Mm-hmm.
Some event stores allow to filter by event type for performance optimization. Now drop the first one, but you allow to filter by event types and tags. And then you can, you can read specific events, but especially when you write, instead of just specifying the expected version, you kind of say, I expect no event after that sequence number giving that query. And with that, you can enforce the same consistency boundaries, but it's much more flexible because you can just, you can just pick and choose what kind of consistencies you want to.
So can I ask a question, because I think you have more thought about this more than I have. And so in a traditional context, you might have to be dealing like with race conditions, and so you're generally saying it's the stream version that I'm optimistically locking against, and this solves the race condition problem. But in this context, you're saying it's about an overall event store version more than it is the stream version.
Kinda, except for, I mean, you could simplify, of course, and say, like, I just read whatever events I'm interested in, make my decision based on that projected in-memory state, and I remember the last sequence number I read, and then I say, always fail if there's any new event, but that would, of course, be
No,
the same like in huge aggregate. Yeah. So on top of that, I say, okay, I accept new events, but no new events that also match the same query I was asking before.
Mm.
So if I'm interested in, for example, does the username exist? My query would be any sign up events with that username tag. And so if there's, well, and then I enforce that when I'm writing, I pass the same query, and it can ensure that there's no matching event in the meantime, right?
It's interesting. I'd have to think about it more. So I would be hesitant. I would be hesitant. Like, does this mean you end up with more kind of lock collisions? Do you think?
No,
No.
I don't think so. I mean, you still have the. I would say even less. Let's take a different example. The example of Sarah's talk is actually quite a good one, I think, and you can simplify it to just the gist of it, which is there's students that can subscribe to courses, and then she establishes two constraints that come from the domain. So she says one course can have no more than 10 students, and each student can only subscribe to 5 courses, let's say. And even with that, and it's not a very esoteric example, I think it's rather realistic. But already now you have an issue. How do you solve that in the regular? And I know that there's ways around. Yeah, right. Usually you have these kind of two-phase commits where you say, well, first I enforce the consistency of the student, publish that event, then try the same on the course. If that fails, I have to conflict resolution and so on, right? But it gets quite complex. And also you end up with 2 events on 2 different streams that actually reflect one thing that happened, right? And so her solution is to just have this one event tagged with the course the students are subscribing to and the student. And so there's less chance of a collision, I would say, even.
So what do you perceive as the downsides to this method?
That's a very good question, because well, we talked about it. I think we started talking about it a year ago now, and we did some proof of concepts. I have a working implementation with PHP. It's not polished through, but it's used in 3 productive projects, and it also almost feels too good to be true, I have to say. I mean, I would say the drawback could be the implementation of the event store gets slightly more complex. We made it work with Postgres, MySQL, and SQLite, but I can imagine the current implementation might not scale the same way a classical approach would scale. But I don't see any conceptual issues. It's more like it's the limits of my database knowledge. And I know that Action is trying to build it into their framework, and I got some JavaScript implementations. So it seems to work. And maybe a drawback is, well, one of the things you have to know that those tags, they have to come from the domain. Like, so your domain event has to know what kind of domain concepts it's about, of course. But in reality, it turns out that it's always quite obvious, right? So, I mean, in the case of the username, it's a little bit special, because now if you let's say you allow the user to change their username, then you have to, in that one event, you have to tag it with the old and the new username, because otherwise you miss that kind of. But so kind of a few details you have to think about, but I would say far less than the alternative.
So the tags are like an arbitrary string that's indexed.
Yes, and usually it's like something colon something, so it would be like username colon and the hash of the username, for example.
Yeah, and you support an arbitrary number of them.
Right.
Yeah, so I can see how that could be slightly inconvenient for the event store, but probably not too big of a deal, right?
Yeah. Well, I haven't tried it in like huge scale, so, but I'm pretty sure there is no conceptual issue. It's
What about the actual
yeah.
like the actual code model? So one of the things I like is I have this event stream, and this event stream basically exists in order to feed this aggregate as a practical optimization to have what I would call a right model, but Frank would call maybe a decider, a decision model. Um, and so what I end up with is my decision model is kind of like this really easy to comprehend thing that's the events tend to come from this source, and this tends to be the place where those specific decisions are made. Do you find that in this dynamic, more dynamic boundary model, some of this is distributed a little bit more, or what's the locality like?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's even another plus point. So what we realized while playing with it is like you get away from these aggregate kind of things that they just collect things and then you make decisions based on it, into really dedicated small projections. Like with that student and course example, you might have like the subscribing a student to a course, it has like these 4 constraints. The course has to exist, the student has to exist, the student must not have more subscriptions, and the course must not be full. And all of those can be 4 really simple projections, all returning just a Boolean, for in this example, like, is the course full? Does it exist? And and the code is really easy as well. And then you can just compose it and say, like, in this case, I want to like build up a state with these 4 responses, and we even like we added one additional well, you can query for tags and event types, but we also added one special case where you just say, like, this projection is just interested in the last event of that whatever matches, because then in that case you only need to look at the last event in many cases. So you end up reading only really a couple of events for this, and by making it composable, you can easier reuse that stuff in other parts.
It's interesting. It feels a little bit more like there's more emphasis on the query, like a bigger part of the state is on the query. So the query is tied to the model, is tied to the decision, and there's a little bit more coupling there. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. And then so okay, I want to make the decision based on these events. How does this scale when it comes to more event schemas, different versions of events, etc.? Um, have you any experience with that?
Well, not really, because it's not that we have that long-term usage, I have to say. But I don't see where it would be an issue, especially because it's much more volatile, the code you write. I mean, the events, of course, they have to reflect what actually happened. But as long as you have that, it's much easier to map it. And one thing I should add, maybe I mean, the idea of DCB is just about that event store interface, but we like the higher level application code that I've been writing for it. I'm still like figuring out how to glue it all together, and that's more language specific, I would say. With PHP, we're a little bit limited, but the idea is not that you write those queries. It's more like I just write these small projections that I just mentioned, and from that I can just construct the query because I know what events types I'm interested in and so on. So
the
that's
projection's still responsible for dealing with versioning if that's necessary of these schemas. So like
right.
if I'm pulling in like 3 versions of the same event, it's still the case that is the case even with an aggregate approach that this projection might have to deal with that.
I would say, I mean, that usually I always have a layer between the core event store that just returns the blobs to turning them into domain events, and in that layer I would usually make that upcasting,
Right.
and then all the projections they don't even know about it. So
Yeah, so one challenge I've had with upcasting is do you end up with just a lot of optional like
yeah,
option types with the new properties like to me that's like a something I would like to avoid. Do you have experience with this?
no, not really. I mean, I have some experience with the classical event sourcing, but no, not that I would say like
I
I
think
mean that it's yeah.
you can do a lot of things like you can say like you can if this would have a string in some circumstances you can just put this string like no data or not applicable, or like you can have default values, empty string, whatever. You can decide if that's relevant for you. Sometimes it feels like in order to upcast effectively you actually have to kind of define the fact that there's no data. There's just literally
Right.
no value.
Yeah, right. Maybe that's the one thing I could add. What we ended up doing is have the like the constructor of the domain events being private, and then there's some explicit deserialization. So, and in that I can do different decisions than when I manually input, so that I can still force that you have to specify this field. But when I deserialize it, I can still fall back to some default. But I think whenever you do some kind of falling back to a default, then that means that you have events that miss the information. And then, I mean, there's not so much you can do about it. Maybe except for realizing that it's in fact a different kind of event. That's also sometimes I saw like people adding stuff to the events because now they have new cases, but that sometimes means it's actually it
Yeah,
was a
absolutely.
different case from the beginning. Yeah.
Another problem I have with upcasting, especially with default values, is that these default values don't tend to get written into the store, and the default values can change, and so then you end up with this idea of like what would be an immutable stream, but it's not really immutable actually now because you're just
Yes,
arbitrarily applying values to it.
that's true. Yeah, yeah. In general, I think it's. I really value the notion of the unique source of truth of event sourcing, and sometimes we weaken that by our hacks
Yeah.
and like like the workarounds, for example, for these spreaded aggregates, let's call it, like usernames. Of course you can create a different read model, but what if it runs out of sync? And I really like that having these one and also like not being required to like re-emit basically the same event to a different stream, because for that course example, it's just much more easy to work with to have like this single point in time where this happened, right?
So we don't have long left on the stream, but I would like to ask you if you're game for it. Is what do you think? Like, so if there are people who are deciding, should I consider event sourcing? Should I move in this direction? Uh, what first of all, what do you think? Like, what should the advice be? And for you personally, like, how willing are you, and how open are you to event source a new system? Uh, to like I've said this before, to me it's like almost my default way of thinking now. It's not that I would necessarily use it everywhere, but I'm probably much more likely to use it than other people. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think I feel quite the same as you. I also have quite a similar background. I think probably not as long. I learned from you quite a lot in the last years, but it's the same for me. So for my own projects, it's my default go-to because well, I wouldn't use it for a CRUD project, but then again, I don't try to work on CRUD projects to begin with. What I'm always a bit slow when introduced, like I'm doing like try to help software agencies to get their projects going, and if they're not into it, I'm trying not to get them into it too soon before they don't know haven't learned about that domain, because I learned that yeah, if you get the events wrong to start with, it makes things easier. It makes things quite difficult. So that's why I try always to slow down a little bit. But yeah, in general, I'm in sync with you. I think it's a much easier mental model once you know all the things. And that's probably the biggest part of it. And I'm keen to get people to know the tools and the implications better, and don't take 10 years like I did.
So, Frank mentioned that he's okay with, for example, with an aggregate, people putting getters on it and using those and learning this way. How do you approach training people that you're working with, or how would you use an approach like this maybe to ease them into this? Because to me, I'm a little bit hesitant, to be completely honest. Like I'm much more rigid when I'm teaching these ideas, and I'm just kind of curious where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, the thing, yeah, I'm also a bit skeptical, to be honest, because I think there's no shortcut to learning some fundamentals, especially about consistency, because that's different than what you used to. I mean, people sometimes don't get it if they work with classical database, so they're not completely consistent. But usually, it's really edge cases. But in event sourcing, you have to deal with it, or at least know about it, I think. And that's why I'm also quite skeptical with, people using a library that abstracts this away from them. Maybe it's easier for them to get started, but I've seen it often enough that then it grows, and then they run into these, like, especially with parallel processes that you don't see while you develop it, and then it's too late, and then it's really complex to work around it. So I'm also on that side that you said. Like, I think it's makes sense to build the event store, or at least everything around it yourself. Build just the thing that you need. If you don't need projections, don't build the whole projection state management, and just build it when you need it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you are choosing kind of where you want the pain in a way, and ideally we can manage it so there's overall less pain, or there's less pain at one bottleneck, or like we have to make a decision like where the pain lies. I have favored just like dropping people into freezing cold water, and for some reason it like this serves me philosophically, because I feel like I I I'm less likely to want to use more friendly terminology. I'm more likely to want to use jargon, because I feel like if we use the jargon, we make it very clear that you don't know what this means. And so then you have to learn what it means, and then you have an idea, and it makes it more obvious, because to me, like, something I'm trying to avoid is a circumstance where you think you know, and there's all that you actually don't. Like, it's like a false positive, right? If that makes sense. So I have been favoring kind of like just shocking people into dealing with a lot of new stuff at once. And I can say, like, it's not all roses, right? Like, there are real negatives to doing it this way. I guess like one of the places I'm like most I need to develop the most and mature the most is how I work with people and onboard into these ideas. And so this is something I'm hoping to develop more, over time. Um, but I don't know, like, we have just a couple minutes left. Do you have like some final thoughts, or any other thing you'd like to bring up here?
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree that I recently gave some event sourcing workshop where they didn't know about it at all, and it I think it worked quite well to really start up really simple, because in the end, just like writing events, it's just, I mean, you don't need anything for it, but then trying to push them into the issues that come with it. Like, if I now put that into some event bus that is just some in-memory storage, and then here I listen to it, and then I do something, what happens if one of those fails? And questions like this that you don't have apparent immediately if you don't think about it. And then that's why now we want to separate that, like, make that commit of the event transaction and so on, like build it up from them, so we can try to get them to understand the reasoning behind it. That's something I would help. And maybe the last thing I would like, the whole dynamic consistency boundary. I'm in the process of, well, we are to write it all up to get a specification going, and I would really like to have it challenged, because yeah, I would really like to discuss that further with people like you.
Yeah, okay. So why don't you like develop that up a bit, and let's come back and let's talk about it again.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the chat. I hope to talk to you again. It's been really nice.
Great. Thank you. So likewise.
See you.
Bye.
All right. Let me see if I can find my stream manager again. I have absolutely had to learn everything about streaming in the past couple days, or past week. I have a question here. How would you handle deprecated events? I mean, they don't matter the domain anymore, but are still being serialized, deserialized as part of the event stream. Um, I'm in this place now where I'm very much thinking about various properties that I want from the system, and for the purpose of keeping them simple and reducing the costs. Uh, so one of the things that I'm doing is I'm trying to make like a large portion of the system like really temporally tight, like finite. So once I've done processed through, for example, financial transaction, I don't really have much of an interest in keeping these old records. It's not a monolithic system where I need to create like a listing of all things or something like this necessarily, because I would like try not to do that, because then I have to keep things around. What I'd like to do is have like an operational window and then be able to cold storage things after that, like put them to the side, store them, maybe commit summary events. So like once the financial transaction is completed, there's a summary event with all of the details I ever need, store that, cold storage everything else, right? Then there's complications with all of this because I use a relational store. There's indexes involved, removing data, dealing with indexes. It's not an unsolvable problem, but it is a more complex problem. But I think that you basically have a lot of uh, choices about what to do about like your old events. You can just choose to remove them, or choose to archive them, or if you want to make it so that when your mechanism is deserializing, like the way I like to do deserialization is I store the events in like a JSON uh, blob basically, and then I pull those into my system, and I have assignments like in a bootstrapping modules that say, hey, this event type or this payload type is tied to this class or whatever, and it's so it's connected, so I know how to deserialize those in that way. But you can just as like you can just similarly say, hey, if I don't have any assignment, or if I don't have anything specified, I just won't reconstitute this object. And so when you get the event stream, those are kind of omitted, or like I don't think this is like a difficult problem to solve. You can just choose how to solve it, but I also don't really know the kind of constraints you're facing. But thank you everyone for showing up. Thanks for asking questions, and special thanks for the people who who jump on stream to talk. I would love to hear your feedback on what's interesting or not interesting about this experiment. I'm going to go ahead and stream again, same time next week. Yeah. So that's it for today. Thanks everybody again. Logging